You hear the roar before you see anything else. Thousands of voices, rising and falling like a violent tide. The air smells of wet wood, unwashed bodies, and smoke from a dozen braziers scattered across the square. You're being pulled forward, rope biting into your wrists, and when you finally lift your head, you see it. The scaffold, the ladder, the fire already burning, waiting for pieces of you that are still attached. In a few minutes they will carve you apart while you're still breathing, and the crowd will cheer. This is not a nightmare. This is November 24th, 1326, and this is justice. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. It's honestly surreal to me that a story this dark, this raw, still pulls us in from every corner of the globe. Drop a comment and let me know. The man standing on that scaffold in Hereford was not a criminal in the ordinary sense. He had never been a murderer, never led a rebellion, never taken up arms against his king. In fact, he had done the opposite. He had stood closer to the King of England than almost anyone else in the realm. He had whispered into the royal ear, shaped policy, amassed land and titles, and lived in luxury most nobles could only dream of. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger, and just months earlier he had been one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Now, in front of Queen Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and a baying crowd of commoners and lords alike, he was about to be destroyed in one of the most horrific public executions England had ever staged. And the method they chose was no accident. Every mutilation, every symbolic act, every scream, it was all deliberate. Because Hugh wasn't just being punished for corruption or greed. He was being erased for something far more dangerous: intimacy with the king. To understand how a man rises so high and falls so catastrophically, we need to go back to the beginning. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born around 1286 into a world of privilege. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had served Edward the Rune with distinction. His mother descended from the Earl of Warwick's line. From childhood, Hugh was groomed for one purpose: to serve the crown and secure his family's influence. He was educated, refined, politically astute. Everything about his upbringing pointed toward a bright future in the royal court, but it was the arrival of a new king that changed everything. In 1307, Edward II ascended the throne, and he was nothing like his father. Edward III had been a warrior king, feared and respected. Edward II was softer, more withdrawn, and, most notoriously, he formed intense, even scandalous relationships with male favorites. The first was Piers Gaveston, a flamboyant knight who Edward showered with titles, land, and affection. Gaveston flaunted his power, mocked the barons, and made no effort to hide his influence over the king. The nobility seethed. By 1312, they had had enough. Gaveston was captured and executed without trial, his head struck off in a field. A vacuum opened beside the king, and Hugh Despenser was ready to fill it. By 1316, Hugh had maneuvered himself into Edward's inner circle. He was appointed Chamberlain of the royal household, a position that gave him constant, intimate access to the king. Their bond deepened quickly, some said too quickly. To further cement his status, Hugh married Eleanor de Clare, the king's own niece, a union that brought him the wealthy lordship of Glamorgan in Wales. But land and titles were never enough for Hugh. He wanted more, and with Edward's protection, there seemed to be no limit. Hugh began seizing estates across England and Wales with ruthless efficiency. He manipulated legal proceedings to dispossess rivals, stripped widows of their inheritances, even turned on his own in-laws. He acted openly, shamelessly, as if the law itself bent to his will. And in many ways it did, because the king would not touch him. The barons watched in fury. By 1321, they had reached their breaking point. A coalition of lords rose in rebellion, demanding Hugh's removal. Edward, under pressure, agreed to exile him. But Hugh didn't slink away quietly. He turned pirate. Yes, pirate. From his base abroad, he raided English merchant ships, a brazen middle finger to the realm that had cast him out. It didn't last. In 1322, Edward crushed the rebellion and reasserted control. Hugh returned to England harder, colder, and more dangerous than before. From 1322 to 1326, he didn't just advise the king, he ruled through him. The chronicler Jean Froissart would later write that Hugh was king in all but name. He monopolized access to Edward, controlled appointments, manipulated policy, and amassed a fortune that rivaled the crown itself. But there was something else, something that couldn't be written openly in the chronicles, but was whispered in corridors and taverns across the kingdom. Many believed that Hugh and Edward were not just political allies. They believed they were lovers. In medieval England, that accusation was poison. Same-sex intimacy was condemned as sodomy, a sin against God and nature, punishable by death. Whether the rumors were true hardly mattered. The mere suggestion was enough to taint both men, to undermine their legitimacy, and to give their enemies a weapon far more powerful than any sword. And no one hated Hugh more than Queen Isabella. Isabella of France had once been a woman of real influence. The daughter of the French king, she had brought prestige and diplomatic weight to Edward's court. But Hugh systematically dismantled her power. He cut her out of decisions, drained her income, and even interfered with her role as a mother. In 1324, he went too far. He seized her estates, imprisoned her servants, and, most shockingly, removed her children from her care, placing them under the custody of his own wife, Eleanor. For Isabella, that was the final humiliation. When she was sent to France in 1325 to negotiate a treaty, she had no intention of coming back as Edward's obedient queen. In Paris, she met Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who had once been imprisoned by Hugh and escaped the Tower of London in a daring breakout. The two became lovers, and they began to plot. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small force of mercenaries. They didn't need a large army. The kingdom was ready to explode. Nobles who had suffered under Hugh's greed rallied to Isabella's banner almost instantly. Support for Edward collapsed. Panic spread through the court. Edward, Hugh, and Hugh's father fled west, dragging the royal treasury behind them. But there was nowhere to go. Allies deserted. Towns closed their gates. The people themselves rose in rebellion. Hugh the Elder was captured at Bristol and executed without ceremony, hanged in his armor, beheaded, quartered, his remains left for dogs. Edward and Hugh the Younger pressed deeper into Wales, but the net was closing. On November 16th, they were captured near Neath. The king was taken prisoner, and within weeks he was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. But Hugh's fate would be far worse than Edward's. Knowing what awaited him, Hugh tried to die on his own terms. He stopped eating, starving himself in a desperate attempt to escape the executioner's hands. For days, he refused all food, his body wasting away. But even this escape was denied him. By the time he was dragged to Hereford in late November, he was skeletal, hollow-eyed, barely able to stand, but still alive. On November 24th, he was brought before a tribunal. Queen Isabella was there. Roger Mortimer was there, and so were the barons who had suffered under his rule. The trial was a formality. The charges were read: treason, corruption, abuse of power, theft, but the verdict had been decided long before he arrived. This was not justice. This was theater. The marketplace at Hereford was packed. Nobles, merchants, peasants, they had come from miles around to witness the fall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. The scaffold stood in the center of the square, and beside it, a fire burned. Hugh was bound to a tall ladder so the crowd could see him from every angle. They forced a crown of stinging nettles onto his head, a cruel parody of the power he had once wielded. Biblical verses condemning pride and wickedness were scrawled across his bare skin. And then, the mutilation began. First, they castrated him. His genitals were hacked away and thrown into the fire while he was still conscious, still watching. The crowd roared. It was a punishment designed to condemn the rumors of sodomy, to humiliate and destroy him in the most symbolic way possible. But that was only the beginning. Still alive, Hugh was cut open. His belly was slit and his intestines were slowly drawn out, then tossed onto the flames. Witnesses said the sound he made was inhuman, a howl of agony that echoed across the square. The execution was drawn out deliberately, every second a spectacle for the crowd's approval. At last, after what must have felt like an eternity, he was hanged. The rope bit deep into his neck, jerking his wasted body upward, cutting off breath and sound in one terrible instant. For a moment, the square fell silent, tens of thousands watching, the smoke curling around the scaffold like a living thing. Then came the roar. The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of satisfaction, the final punctuation to years of hatred. Hugh Despenser the Younger was dead at last. But even in death, the humiliation did not end. His head was struck from his body, cleanly severed by the executioner's axe. The lifeless corpse, once dressed in silks and rings, was reduced to raw flesh and splintered bone. Then came the quartering. With solemn efficiency, his limbs were hacked apart, 4 pieces, each destined for a different corner of the realm. One went north, one south, one west, and one east, each nailed high above city gates. They were not just warnings. They were political announcements. The destruction of a man who had stood too close to royal power had been made into a message for all England to see. Hugh's head, however, was reserved for a place of special display. It was carried to London, set upon a tall spike above London Bridge. Travelers entering the capital could not avoid it. For months, perhaps years, it hung there, blackened by weather, the mouth fixed in a grotesque half-scream. Children were told to look away, but they always looked. Merchants crossed themselves as they passed beneath. Priests muttered prayers for the soul that had once inhabited it. The head became both relic and warning, a crownless effigy, staring forever toward a city that had once bowed to his will. But what unfolded that day was not mere revenge. It was ritual. Every gesture, every mutilation was a piece of moral theater. His castration condemned the sin, the whispered rumor of unnatural love between him and the king. His disembowelment symbolically cleansed the corruption he was said to have brought to the kingdom. His quartering displayed the absolute authority of the crown and its new masters. The execution was not chaos, it was choreography. It was the purification of the body politic, with Hugh's broken flesh as the sacrificial offering. In this way, his death was transformed into a sermon, the wages of pride and forbidden power. 4 years later, in 1330, the crown relented. Hugh's widow, Eleanor de Clare, was at last granted permission to recover what little remained of him. By then, there was almost nothing left to gather. A severed head, a thigh bone, a few shards of brittle spine. Eleanor carried them to Tewkesbury Abbey, where monks received the fragments in silence. In that quiet stone church, far from the roar of Hereford, they dug a small grave. No banners, no heralds, just the widow of a fallen favorite kneeling beside the pit. The woman, who had once been niece to the king and lady of vast estates, wept over a handful of bones. The world that had once trembled at her husband's name had moved on. As for Edward the Sioux, the man for whom Hugh had risked everything, his end was no less shadowed. Stripped of crown and title, the former king was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. The chroniclers say his cell was damp and narrow, the air heavy with rot. He was fed little and spoken to less. In September 1327, less than a year after Hugh's execution, Edward was found dead under mysterious circumstances. The most infamous tale claims that he was murdered with a red-hot poker thrust into his rectum, a killing meant to leave no external mark, yet to echo the accusations that had destroyed his reign. The detail was obscene, but its symbolism was clear. Humiliation for humiliation. sin purged by fire. Whether that story was true hardly matters now. What matters is that it was believed. The rumor became its own kind of execution, retold in monasteries, taverns, and courts for generations. The story of Edward's death, like Hugh's, became part of the political mythology of the age, a warning wrapped in scandal. It showed how easily rumor could be weaponized, how morality could be twisted to destroy a man's legacy as surely as an axe could destroy his body. Yet the architects of that vengeance soon felt the wheel turn against them. In 1330, the young Edward III, barely 18, seized power from his mother's lover, Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was dragged to Tyburn and hanged as a traitor, the same sentence he had orchestrated for Despenser. His body, too, was left to rot, his estates seized by the crown. Queen Isabella, once triumphant, was stripped of her power and placed under house arrest. The kingdom had devoured its own avengers. The fire they had lit to cleanse England now consumed them in turn. Nearly 7 centuries later, Hugh Despenser's name still refuses to lie quietly in the grave. To some historians, he remains the great villain of the 14th century, a man of boundless greed whose arrogance drove a king to ruin. To others, he is something far more complicated, a figure caught in the machinery of royal favor, a victim of the very system he once mastered. The records of his crimes were written by his enemies, and every chronicler wrote with a political purpose. His story forces us to question how much of villainy is truth, and how much is propaganda written by the victors. In the politics of medieval England, accusations of sodomy were never just about private sin. They were tools of destruction. To call a man a sodomite was to strip him of divine favor, to make him unfit to rule, to erase him not just from office but from moral legitimacy. Whether Hugh and Edward were truly lovers mattered less than the accusation itself. The scandal was enough to destroy them both, and perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of Hugh Despenser's story, its familiarity. We still see the rise and fall of elites built on intimacy, ambition, and the favor of those in power. We still watch reputations collapse under the weight of scandal, truth blurred with rumor until no one can tell them apart. The same machinery that tore Hugh apart still grinds on in subtler forms. Less bloody, perhaps, but no less ruthless. Hugh Despenser rose higher than almost anyone of his age, and when he fell, his destruction was staged like a public performance. His body was scattered, but his story endured. In the end, the fire that consumed his flesh could not erase his name. The crowd that cheered his death could not silence the questions his life still raises. Power, ambition, desire, betrayal, they are as old as kingdoms and as near as today. And somewhere, in the echo of that scaffold, in the drifting ash of that fire, Hugh Despenser still whispers his warning. History never forgets.